Part 2, a papacy deeply shaped by dialogue. From the beginning, we saw that Pope Francis carried himself as Pope in a way that differed from his successors, from the way that he came out on the balcony at St. Peter's that first night and said, "Buonasera," and the way in which he asked people to pray for him before he gave them a blessing. We also saw the way in which he spoke about his own background and his cultural world, the way he often spoke about Argentina, told stories about his grandmother, very earthy and a very human approach. Clearly someone who prioritized relationships and didn't see those relationships as entirely ending when he became Pope. So we heard about the phone calls that he frequently makes to people. We heard about how he phoned his news seller in Buenos Aires to say, "I have to cancel my subscription," as though the fellow hadn't heard. We heard about how he went to pay the bill at the Vatican residence where he used to stay, which coincidentally was the residence I lived at when I worked in Rome. And then that beautiful interview that he gave with Jesuit journals throughout the world, A Big Heart Open to God, where he talked about his past and where he also talked about his sins, mistakes he's made, in a very humble and forthright way. So he was engaging us already in a dialogue from his own life experience. We also know that Pope Francis, when he preaches or when he's giving a talk, he'll often say, "I have a prepared text here, but I'm just going to put that aside and speak from the heart." And usually the word that comes from the heart is a very eloquent and beautiful word. Now, Pope Francis certainly sees dialogue and reaching out to others as intrinsic to what God does in Jesus. At a recent homily for new cardinals, he was talking about Jesus healing the leper. And he says Jesus wants to heal the leper. Jesus responds immediately to his plea without waiting to study the situation, all its possible consequences. For Jesus, what matters above all is reaching out to save those far off, healing the wounds of the sick, restoring everyone to God's family. Those of you who read The Joy of the Gospel, his great apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, would have known that he dedicates 20 paragraphs to preaching. And when he talks about the importance of preaching, he talks about preaching as dialogue and preaching as a privileged place where we stand in this dialogue between God and humanity. There's a little section called Words Which Set Hearts on Fire. Not all homilies set hearts on fire, as you know. But it's beautiful when they do, right? And he says, dialogue is more than the communication of a truth. It arises from the enjoyment of speaking, and it enriches those who express their love for one another through words. There's an enrichment which does not consist in objects, but in persons engaged in dialogue. And then he says preaching is not simply to be a lecture or a communication of morals or doctrine. It's a heart-to-heart communication which has a quasi-sacramental character. So a beautiful reflection on preaching as an engagement in dialogue. Now, Pope Francis has also showed himself to be eager to be in conversation with those who don't see things the same way. He says we shouldn't back away from those who disagree with us. And last month he gave a little interview with a very small news bulletin from one of Buenos Aires' poorest neighborhoods, La Cracova News. And he was asked if there are people around him who are not in agreement with what he says. And he says, yes, of course there are. And then he was asked how he interacts with them. And his response is quite beautiful. He says, listening to people for me never did me any harm. Another one-line quote from Pope Francis that's very memorable. Every time I listened to them, it always went well. Those times that I didn't listen, it went badly. Even if you don't agree with them, they always give you something. Or, if they don't give you something, they put you in a situation that forces you to rethink your position and that enriches you. Now, don't mistake a spirit of dialogue from Pope Francis with a kind of a wishy-washiness. It's not about being vague in one's convictions or one's beliefs. Much to the contrary, dialogue presupposes that you know where you stand and that you speak from where you stand, that you're rooted in your tradition. In the meeting with the Korean bishops, he has quite a beautiful reflection on the two things that are essential in dialogue. On this vast continent, which is home to a great variety of cultures, the Church is called to be versatile and creative in her witness to the gospel through dialogue and openness to all. This is the challenge before you. Dialogue, in fact, is an essential part of the mission of the Church in Asia. But in undertaking the path of dialogue with individuals and cultures, what should be our point of departure and our fundamental point of reference, which guides us to our destination? Surely it is our own identity, our identity as Christians. We cannot engage in real dialogue unless we are conscious of our own identity. We can't dialogue, we can't start dialoguing from nothing, from zero, from a foggy sense of who we are. But on the other hand, nor can there be authentic dialogue unless we're capable of opening our minds and hearts in empathy and sincere receptivity to those with whom we speak. In other words, an attentiveness in which the Holy Spirit is our guide. Last point in this little section is the way in which Pope Francis has called for open dialogue within the Church. And I'm thinking of his address just at the start of the Extraordinary Synod last fall on the family. A cardinal had gone to him and said, some of the cardinals feel that they probably shouldn't really speak their mind at the synod because they might disagree with you. And Pope Francis said, no, not at all. Everybody is to speak their minds clearly. A general condition is this: speak clearly, let no one say, this you can't say. Speak boldly, and he uses this Greek word, parousia, which means speak with boldness, but at the same time, listen deeply, listen humbly.